And here we are again, Tyler, for another episode of Classic Vinyl Podcast.
A beautiful episode. Significant.
Yeah. Most of them are significant, though, aren't they?
Yeah,
us.
That's true. But this one is hitting its 60th birthday.
Correct. It's the 60th anniversary of this release from the Beatles. And of course, this is their second UK album that we're going to review today with the Beatles. It's kind of your, second roundabout of listening to this?
Yeah. With a couple of extras, I must add, because we've got a couple of singles that we're tagging onto this too.
Well, as you know, and maybe our listeners do know, the Beatles are by far my favorite group of all time. And so we're going to go through and review all the Beatles studio albums. And this would be the second one we've done. And we're doing this because of the 60th anniversary. And of course, it's with the Beatles. Let me give a little history on the Beatles if you don't know. A little rock band formed in Liverpool, England in 1960, and many people, including myself, consider them most influential band of all time. They had 20 number one hits in the U.S., 27 total in the U.S. and the U.K. combined. And the funny thing is, and we were talking about this before, they would have had probably more number one hits if it wasn't for some of their other songs keeping their other songs out of that place.
Well, when you look at the way things were back then, this was like cutting edge new rock and roll. This was the sort of stuff that people were just eating it up. And so it was a gold mine, and they were just trying to mine as much out of it as they could, as fast as they could. They didn't really figure out until later on, even towards probably the 70s, that there is some economics to this, that you can milk the success for a little bit and sell more records that way.
Well, and that became what the recording process is. We got into 8-track recording and it became more of a studio thing. At this time, they were going in and playing these things live. They cut a lot of tracks, but I mean, this is the second album they released in 1963, and they were riding the wave, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And so they were releasing a lot of music. To date, sold 183 million albums of all time. They're the greatest selling band or musical artist anywhere. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr formed the Beatles. Originally John Lennon formed the Quarrymen. Paul McCartney joined them as rhythm guitar, and George Harrison soon joined after. They were called Johnny and the Moondogs for a little while with just 3 guitarists. And of course, once they changed to the Beatles spelled B-E-A-T is kind of a play on the word, like Buddy Holly and the Crickets. It's a bug, but beat, being, and then music. Yeah. Brian Epstein became their manager, and what really led him into the suits and the haircuts and the boots, and kind of led him into that early Beatlemania stage. They did cut their teeth as a band in Hamburg and the Cavern Club in Liverpool. The funny thing about them, and we'll kind of get into this a little bit later, is up until Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the albums released in the U.S. were completely different than the albums released in the U.K., which is kind of strange. And so a lot of people that lived through it, which I did not in the 60s, I'm not used to the U.S. albums because I was used to the 1987 CD releases that when they re-released them all as the British albums. I Want to Hold Your Hand, first number one hit here in the States in 1963. It was number one by mid-January of 64. It's really what started Beatlemania. Of course, February 7th, 1964, 3,000 fans waiting for them as they arrived, and that's really what kicked it all off here. Ed Sullivan Show, 73 million viewers. That was 1/3 of the U.S. population watched the Beatles. And of course, we didn't have as many stations at that time, 3 or 4, but I don't think you get that anywhere anymore.
No, there's not even that many people watching the Super Bowl. I'll bet you that if we were to look at it, fewer people watch 9/11 happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy the amount of people that tuned into Ed Sullivan. The Beatles have released several movies. Some have been hits, some have been flops, and even the flops have kind of been cult classics now as we go back to them, Their last concert ever at Candlestick Park in San Francisco on August 29th of 1966, and that's really when they focused on, instead of touring, they were going to focus on building their music in the studio, and they really, from Sgt. Pepper on, made a focus on this can only be created in the studio, and we'll send the album out on tour for us. And it was quite the change because they were riding high, and they could have kept touring, they could have kept releasing the little pop records and doing what they were doing, but it was a pretty big change for them. So the studio years, consist of, like I said, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Magical Mystery Tour, the White Album, Let It Be, Abbey Road. One of the key things to their success was their producer, George Martin. A lot of people talk about who the fifth Beatle is, and a lot of people have different views on that. I consider it George Martin, without a doubt. Now, we were talking about the amount of music they released, 13 studio albums in 7 years. Very rarely do any band nowadays, maybe 2 albums in 7 years, possibly, but the amount of albums are released, and that's just albums, not including all their released singles that didn't even hit albums. So pretty crazy. Lennon and McCartney are considered probably the best writing duo of all time.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, and Harrison isn't too bad himself either. Going into the Beatles, Paul McCartney's released 26 studio albums, 7 with Wings, 3 with the Firemen, 50 million in album sales, just solo. John Lennon, 23 million in album sales, 11 studio albums, and of course he was killed in December of 1980. George Harrison has released 12 studio albums, 10 million sales, and died on November 29th, 2001 at the age of 58. Ringo Starr is obviously still with us. He's released 20 studio albums and has had 2 million album sales as a solo artist. All the Beatles, they're all in the Hall of Fame as the Beatles, of course, and in the Hall of Fame as solo artists. So we're going to do something a little different tonight because of the way the Beatles did. We normally get right to the album, but what we did for this is the Beatles did release 2 singles off this album, and that's kind of how they were doing it back in the early years. They'd release a couple singles to lead into the album, but they would not include them on the album. And of course, I wanted to include them here because the one is really the song that led to Beatlemania, especially here in the United States, and that's I Want to Hold Your Hand. It's a Lennon and McCartney composition. It's sang by both Lennon and McCartney. And it was kind of, funny thing is with the Beatles, it was the very first song they ever recorded on a 4-track recorder. It reached number 1 in the UK, US, and a ton of other countries. It was the first number 1 single for the Beatles in the US, and it was basically the song that not only started Beatlemania, but started the whole British invasion. So it was released in the UK with This Boy as the B-side, and that's how we'll be reviewing it, is I Want to Hold Your Hand with This Boy. But in the US, it was released with I Saw Her Standing There as the B-side. And the single itself has sold over 12 million copies worldwide, which is astounding.
That's pretty crazy.
Now, this was released in the US for the first time on the album Meet the Beatles, and Rolling Stone ranks this as high as number 16 of their top 500 songs of all time. And you got to look at this in a little bit different because not only is it a great song and you have to put yourself in the time period, but it's also an influential song, and it's really what kicked everything off for them. What are your thoughts on this song?
This song was an excellent song. This is one of my favorite Beatles songs because it's got such a classic lovey-dovey love song feel to it. This is just so sweet, so innocent and pure. No wonder this is what started it all.
But it rocks too.
Absolutely. It's an excellent... what surprised me most about this song is how much twang there is in the guitar. Almost country-like twang. But boy, it's such a nice, smooth rock and roll song. It's beautiful.
Well, and that's kind of what made the Beatles. They had so many influences from girl groups to Motown to country western music to straight rock and roll, and they really put all of it to play.
Yeah. The other thing that I noticed was they're very heavy on the cymbals in this song too. The brass is just, getting rattled like crazy by Ringo.
That must have been a sound of the time a little bit, because that's one note I have on a lot of the songs is that they're very tinny or cymbally sounding. And you see that from the Stones and a lot of the other bands at the time. It's just must have been kind of the thing, and a little bit of the mixing as well, considering that you didn't have all the tracks to back it up a lot of times.
When it comes to the vocals, let's see, we were talking earlier off the air about the line, I can't hide. It really does sound like he's saying I get high.
Which is what Bob Dylan thought it was.
Yeah, exactly. But listening to it, either line fits. So I'm okay with it either way.
Well, that's what's great about music, because at the time, how would you know? You didn't have the internet to search it up. Hey, what are the lyrics to this or that song? So you could make it whatever you wanted it to be.
Yeah, and it really sounds like he's saying, I get high. He needs to enunciate better if he's saying, I can't hide. There's not a hard T on can't, and there's not a hard D on hide. So what are your thoughts about it?
Well, one of the most recognizable intros ever, one of the most recognizable songs. I mean, I can't help but love this song. I've heard it a lot, knowing it's really what kicked them off here in the States. And I mean, it was also a smash hit in England too. So it's not like only the States, but it's really what got everybody going. It's really what brought them here. It's really what brought Beatlemania to us and brought the British invasion. It's got an amazing bass line. I like the clapping in the song. And the one thing that's a going theme for the whole Beatles career is the amazing harmonies. It's just got amazing harmonies. For such an early song in the early 60s, it really rocks, it moves, it's just got a good beat to it. And to me, it's something that the grandmas could like all the way down to the kids.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think that's why it was such a big hit with everyone.
It's a very special song.
Yeah, it is. So that moves us to the B-side as it was released in the UK, This Boy. Now, this one is another Lennon-McCartney song, and this one couldn't be any more different from I Want to Hold Your Hand.
For sure.
And it's a full harmonized song on this. It's sang by John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison. And it's really Lennon's attempt at a 3-part harmony, kind of like a Smokey Robinson song.
Smokey Robinson was a big influence.
He was. He was definitely one of the big influences, especially to Lennon. It was the B-side of I Want to Hold Your Hand. This was released in the U.S. on Meet the Beatles album. It was also performed on their first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. It reached number 53 in the U.S. as the B-side, but number 1 in Canada for some reason. But what are your thoughts on This Boy?
This is another sweet little song that I really enjoyed, but it's a lot slower. And like you said, very different compared to the other side of the record. What a melancholy little song about a boy who's been jilted. His girl's run off with that boy, and this boy wants her back. And real slow, smooth song, pretty song. I prefer the other side of the album better though, or the other side of the single, I should say. What are your thoughts on this one?
Well, to me, this is what's so special about the Beatles, is even this early, they weren't going to get caught in a trap of playing one kind of song, you know? And as you go later into the Beatles, like I was saying, when they quit touring, they could have kept writing that. You know, you see a lot of bands doing that. They have a formula, they keep going. The Beatles were so artistic that they took the chance to change their image, to change their sound, to change everything they did, to not tour anymore, and try something completely new, and it really worked, right? And propelled them to the next level. And I think this is shown early here is they had the gumption to play something different that maybe some other bands wouldn't. I love the guitar in this song, and the harmonies are beautiful in it.
Yeah.
And John Lennon's vocal, especially when he starts into the chorus, oh, and this boy, you know, when he goes into that, I love his vocal in that. And he plays an amazing triplet on the guitar on this. Just kind of like he does in All My Loving. I love the way he plays those triplets in the guitar. I think it's a beautiful song, and I like how it plays off of I Want to Hold Your Hand from fast to slow, and I think that's one good thing about the Beatles.
Yeah, for sure. This is I would love to have this single album that has one track on each side, just because you can go from, you know, dancing super fast and hip hop on the one side to this really slow, smooth song on the other.
Yeah, it certainly shows their versatility.
Yeah, these guys are, you can tell that these guys are molded or forged in a club scene.
Yeah, so do you want to get to the album review now?
Let's do it.
And now it's time for the album review.
Okay, Tyler, so today we're going to do the Beatles' second studio album with the Beatles. Of course, the second UK studio album as they were meant to be. It was released on November 22nd of 1963 by Parlophone Records, and of course, it's the 60th anniversary this year of this release. It's recorded at EMI Studios in London, which is actually now known as Abbey Road Studios, produced by George Martin. This was the first Beatles album to be recorded on a 4-track recorder. Of course, it's only the second Beatles album, but it was the first one they used a 4-track recorder. This album reached number 1 in the UK, replacing their previous album, Please Please Me, which gave the Beatles the top album for 51 weeks in a row, which is a record in the UK. That's kind of what I was talking about. Who knows how many, you know, if they would have released this a little bit longer, how long would have Please Please Me been at number 1 spot? It's hard to say, you know.
It would be fascinating to find out, though, if we could turn back time.
So it's the Beatles' second album in a row to sell over 1 million copies in the UK. In the US, the tracks on this album were split between Meet the Beatles and the Beatles' second album, which is about the dumbest name for an album I've ever heard of, but it is what it is. But we'll kind of go through that on the track to track. I'll tell you what album the songs were on. The album was not released in the US until 1987 on CD, this British version of it, and that's kind of the version I'm most familiar with because that's what I grew up with. Over 5 million albums have been sold worldwide of With the Beatles. Rolling Stone ranks this album at 420 out of 500. I don't know if that's worth anything, but it's a little tidbit. So the cover's kind of interesting. We're looking at it hanging on the wall there. It's a black and white picture of the band. They've kind of got a half shadow on their face. You got John, George, and Paul on the top, and Ringo's all by himself down on the bottom right.
And I guess it's because he's sitting at his drum set.
He must be. Last one to join the band. I don't know.
And then there's a white band that goes across the top of the album with black lettering writing out there with the Beatles.
Yeah, it's kind of a different look to it. It was a picture taken by Robert Freeman, and it's definitely a departure from their first record that just kind of has a picture of them there at the studios. So kind of an interesting thing. Do you want to get to side one?
Let's do it.
Side 1.
Okay, so With the Beatles, side one opens with It Won't Be Long. This is a Lennon and McCartney composition, but it was primarily written by John Lennon. It is sang by John Lennon. This was released on Meet the Beatles in the U.S. It kind of features the famous yeah. You know, you've got a lot of their songs that have yeah, 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 you know, things like that. But it does feature that kind of like She Loves You, and it's Paul singing that in this. What are your thoughts on It Won't Be Long?
You know, I really like that it's got this hard opening with the vocals. Like they just jump right into it. We're off to the races. You know, they come right out of the gates. And this is a nice little love song. It's, you know, just pining for the time where this guy gets to go and be with the one that he's going to belong to. The line is, "It won't be long till I belong to you," is the second half of that. And it's a real sweet song. It
seems optimistic.
Yeah, exactly. It's beautiful. One thing about the Beatles that you'll hear throughout this entire album is how well they play together. They are just rocking together so nicely. And everybody's a master at their instrument. What are your thoughts on this song?
I like it. I like the way it kicks right into the lyric. I think the guitar licks are good in this. They really stick out. It's got a really decent bass line, which you're going to hear me say about every song. I think Paul McCartney is an amazing bass player. And I think
someone had to play the bass.
They did. And I think, I don't know if he's underrated, but the best bass players of all time are brought up. He's usually not in that conversation, which I think is kind of sad.
A shame, isn't it?
Yeah, because he's an amazing bass player.
Sure is.
And then along with his many voices and his amazing writing ability and his longevity on top of it, you know?
Yeah.
Like I said earlier, the drums are a little tinny in this, and I don't know if that's due to the mixing or just the studio or what. I wish they were mixed a little to the front. Now, of course, we listened to the mono version tonight, and so the guitar and everything's pretty punchy. The bass is punchy. And I do like the first few albums, especially in mono, more than I do stereo. But it does give you a little bit different, just kind of the fake panning on the stereo that's kind of tough to take. But that's why I like the mono. It's a great early Beatles song. There isn't too many early Beatles songs I don't like, but I get in my moods, you know, mid Beatles, late Beatles, early Beatles. It's a good song, good way to start the album. So that brings us to the next song, All I've Got to Do. It's another Lennon-McCartney composition, primarily written by Lennon again, sang by John Lennon again. This one was also released on Meet the Beatles in the U.S. John Lennon was reportedly inspired by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles' song, You Can Depend on Me, which it does sound very similar to that in a little bit different, but I can see the similarities after research and reading that. And one thing about the song, the Beatles never did perform this song live on stage. What are your thoughts on All I've Got to Do?
This is another great power trio classic. This has that really classic 60s or early 60s Beatles sound. That real, what is the word that I'm looking for? Because it's just real sweet and innocent rock and roll, right? They haven't gotten into the whole experimenting with the wall of sounds yet. But this is just a nice song, and I really like the humming outro at the end. I thought that Lennon was excellent there. What did you think about this song?
Once again, I think probably the thing that stands out in this song better than anything is the bass line. I do like the echoey, natural sounding guitar licks. There's not a lot of compression. There's no effects or anything on the guitar, and I really like that sound. Harmonies again in this are wonderful. Lennon, this is an amazing vocal. I love listening to Lennon's early vocals because you kind of get that haunting sound from his voice that you get in later years, and he's an excellent vocalist. He really is, and
sure is.
And to me, these songs, especially on this album, they're just something endearing, kind of touching on what you said about the early 60s Beatles. It's just kind of a thing of its own. I don't always visit the early Beatles stuff, but when I do, it's just really nice to hear because it's a different mood. And this falls right in that rhythm.
Yeah, it's more raw and pure compared to their later stuff that's a lot more intricate.
Well, if you hear a lot of their stuff off their BBC albums, Live at the BBC, a lot of these are straight off of it, just polished a little more for the studio. But you can tell a lot of these, even though this one they never played live, but a lot of these songs do sound live in a way. So that moves us to what's probably the most popular or most well-known song on this album, third track, All My Loving. It's another Lennon-McCartney composition, mainly written by Paul McCartney. It is sang by Paul McCartney, the first song he sings on this album. It was not released as a single in the US or the UK, but it received a ton of radio airplay. Number one single in Canada, and the Canada import in the US did reach number 45, which is really strange. I guess people wanted it that bad. And at the time, I mean...
That's pretty cool.
You had to either get the album or the single, and that's the way it was. This one was also released on Meet the Beatles in the US. And Paul McCartney has stated multiple times that this is the first song that he wrote the lyrics to before he wrote the music. He would generally write the music and then write lyrics to go along with the song, but this one was opposite. This song was a fixture of the band's live set from the time they released it going forward. I mean, it became something that played all the time. And it was the opening song on Ed Sullivan in February of 64 when those 70+ million people saw him. What are your thoughts on All My Lovin'?
This is a really nice song that's a personal vow of fidelity is what I wrote down. This guy is saying he's giving all of his loving to her. He's saving all of it for her. He's not going to, even though he's going away, he's going to be true. He promises this. This also has a really awesome guitar strum in it. It's super fast. Sounds like a banjo. And you and I were talking about that, how difficult that is to play.
That is the triplets Lennon is playing, and he plays them absolutely amazing in this. It's my first note on this, and I underlined it because that's my favorite part of this song. I love the way Lennon plays those.
Yeah, for sure. This song is something that's, what is it? This song is something special, something different because of all of that. And there's all these different elements that piece together to make this just a marvelous work of art. And I really enjoyed this song. What were your thoughts?
Well, like I stated, the triplets make this song completely, but it's got an amazing vocal by McCartney. The bass is good on it again. I think the drums actually kind of shine in this one. It's got a pretty decent solo by George in it, and the harmonies again are once again amazing in this. This is kind of a quintessential early Beatles song. If you were to put together a few songs, this should be one of them that should be included on it. Not only because it's an amazing song, it's recorded well, the music in it is done really well, but because of its importance of being the opening song on Ed Sullivan, the first time the American audience seen and heard them. To me, it's special all the way around. It's an amazing song. So that moves us on to the next song, Don't Bother Me. Now, this is a song written and sang by George Harrison, and this is actually Harrison's first released original song. It was also released on Meet the Beatles album in the U.S., and it was basically written by George while he was sick in a hotel as a plea for privacy. What are your thoughts on this one?
It's got a different kind of sound to it. This isn't a song that you're going to do the twist to. This is more of a jamming song. I gotta say, he really makes his debut on this album extremely well. I like this song And I think that it's got a bit more of a progressive sound than the rest of the songs on this album. This sounds like something more later 60s rock and roll. Beautiful. What did you think about this one?
Well, famously, George Harrison doesn't look too fondly on this song.
That's a shame.
I thought the mix was a little muddy, but it is different. The guitar and bass are good in it, but the drumming is very, very tinny in this one. This is probably the song I liked least as far as the drumming was mixed in it. And the vocals, even though they're good, they have a lot of echo on them, which I don't know if that's the way they were meant to be or what. It's got a really good short guitar solo that was very reminiscent of Chuck Berry, which I'm sure, George was very fond of at the time, as all the Beatles were. And I think it's a good first release for George. And that's kind of what's important about the Beatles is you got all these other groups that have leading men, We're to song 4 on this, and we've already heard 3 different lead singers.
Mm-hmm.
Harmonies from all of them, and by the time the album's over, we'll hear all 4 boys sing. So that moves us to the next song, Little Child, another Lennon-McCartney composition. It's written by John and Paul. Specifically was supposed to be written for Ringo Starr to sing, but for some reason that didn't end up happening. The lead vocal was sang by John Lennon and Paul McCartney together. This is another song they never played live. This song was released on the Beatles' second album in the U.S., and that's the title of the album, Beatles' second album, which was, funny enough, their second album in the U.S. It's the shortest song on the album, 1:45, basically, and that's kind of what's interesting about this album, and Lennon and McCartney have both stated, is they were trying to make every song a single, and that's why pretty much every song is between 2 and 3 minutes here. You don't have any long, epic songs on this album. They're all really short. Yeah. What are your thoughts on Little Child?
This is surprising to find out that they wrote this specifically for Ringo Starr. Maybe it was written about Ringo. This doesn't really showcase the drums either, which Ringo's famous for playing. I'm really taken back by this whole written for Ringo, because he didn't seem to have much to do with it. But then again, there's the theme of it, the Little Child, where he says, "Baby, take a chance with me."
I think a lot of times, maybe they just wrote it, not because it had anything to do with Ringo, but just to give him a song on the album. And they decided, we found another one that's a little better for him. So I don't know if the theme of the song or what the song was about had anything to do with Ringo at all. I just think initially they thought, this might be a good one for Ringo to sing, but it didn't work out that way.
Yeah, it does feature the harmonica, which I would venture a guess to say that it's John Lennon.
It is.
Because it sounds like Lennon playing the harmonica really good.
No, I don't know how you know that, but
I don't know. I've heard him play those harmonica in other ones.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay. What would you think about those?
Harmonica intro, it's good. It's got a good bass line in it. It's got a harmonica solo in it, funny enough. I think it would have done, I don't mind the harmonica. I just would have liked to hear a little more guitar mixed in this song. But other than that, it's, it's a decent song. It's, good album filler. So that moves us to the next song, Till There Was You. Now, this song is a cover on here, which, the first few albums did have some covers on them. It was written by Meredith Wilson and was actually a top 40 hit for Anita Bryant way back in 1959, 4 years previous to this album. This song is sang by Paul McCartney. It was released in the U.S. on the Beatles' second album. I really think this is a song that shows the Beatles' versatility, even this early as a band, is that they were willing to release rockers and then release something like this, because this wasn't a song that a rock and roll band would release.
No, not by any means.
And I think that showed their bravery to show that, hey, we're into all kinds of different music. What are your thoughts on Till There Was You?
This is very simplistic and raw sound. Once again, this is early Beatles stuff. They've taken this song and made it Beatles. And I really appreciate the work that they've done with that. It sounds really good. Yeah, this song, the way it's written, this sounds more like 1950s Rodgers and Hammerstein's show tunes sort of thing, right?
It does. That's why I think it was very brave of them to put something like this on the album. Yeah, they do.
They do an excellent job. And, they take a song that I wouldn't necessarily like, and they put their Beatles spin on it, and I enjoyed it. What do you think?
I shouldn't like this song. I mean, because the kind of music I like is guitar driven and whatever, but the Beatles break all the rules for me. And I think it's a pretty song and it shouldn't fit in with the Beatles, but that's what makes things the Beatles, is that it shouldn't. It's got Ringo playing bongos on it and a pretty acoustic guitar. And it's got a nice little acoustic guitar solo over it. But other than that, it's pretty much an acoustic guitar, bongos, and Paul's vocal. And I think it's weird. It's strange. I think show tune, like you said, 50 show tune, that sounds right. But it somehow fits with the Beatles. And it's become one of it's a song I really enjoy of their early stuff. I really do. And I shouldn't, but I do.
I think you hit it on the head. It's the acoustics that make it sound so simplistic and raw to me.
Yeah, it's very clean sounding song too. The way it's mastered, the way it was recorded is very clean, and I like that. Kind of like Paul's grandpa.
Yeah, which we definitely need more of Paul's grandpa in this world.
Correct. So that moves us on to the last song on side one, Please Mr. Postman. Another cover song. Now this was written by, follow me here, Brian Holland, Robert Bateman, Freddie Gorman, William Garrett, and Georgia Dobbins.
5.
Yeah, that's kind of strange. I don't know if they all got in their group together or how they did that.
Collaboration.
Kind of strange, but it was sang by John Lennon. It's the first Motown song to reach #1 position on the Billboard Top 100 charts by the Marvelettes in 1961. It actually also hit #1 again in 1975 when the Carpenters covered it. And this is another song to me, and I wrote this as a note, that shows the Beatles' versatility early as a group, because this is kind of off bar a little bit too for them. Shows their interest in girl groups and their songs they sang, and they had influences from all over the place. Now, this song was released in the U.S. on the Beatles' second album. What are your thoughts on Please Mr. Postman?
This is very much like a sock hop rock, if there's such a word. But yeah, this is sort of music they play down at the diner while you're having milkshakes or the malts. This is where I wrote down the note that this band plays flawlessly together, and they are perfect on their respective instruments and harmonies. This is a song that's very heavily with backup harmony and with backup singers, and they do it very well. They sound really good together, this whole group. I didn't really expect that coming from the Beatles, but I don't know why I didn't expect it, because boy, these guys have been playing in clubs for their whole time. So this is their wheelhouse, and I didn't really think of it as their wheelhouse. What was your thoughts?
Well, this is another song, just kind of like Till There Was You, that really shouldn't fit the Beatles, but when they play it, it does. Like you said, it's a malt shop song, but it fits early Beatles, and it rocks at the same time. They just simply did justice to it. It's another song that's got an amazing bass line by McCartney to it. I really like Lennon's vocal in this one. Again, it's one of my favorite vocals of his on this album. I like his vocal when it gets strained. I really enjoy that. And I thought the drumming in it was strong. I mean, it's a cover, but for me, I've heard the Marvelettes version of it, and it's just a completely different song.
Yeah.
The Beatles made this one their own, and, for years and years, I didn't know there was another version of it. It just fits, and I think they did an excellent job on it.
I think that we're starting to see the seedlings growing of that experimenting with different sounds in this album. Something that you're going to see a lot more with later Beatles albums.
Well, and the thing with the Beatles is all the bands at the time a lot of them were doing all covers. You look at the Stones' first few albums, they were all covers. And the Beatles, even though their first couple albums, they had a few covers, they quickly got away from that and went straight to original compositions. And they were kind of one of the first bands to lead that. And so it's good to hear these, but I like when the Beatles got into their originals.
Yeah, so when this is something that you see them take other songs that don't fit your typical Beatles stuff, and they make it their own.
You want to get to side 2?
Yep, flip it.
Side 2.
Okay, so side 2 opens up with a Chuck Berry original, Roll Over Beethoven, another one of the Beatles' influences. Now, this song reached number 29 for Chuck Berry way back in 1956, so 7 years previous to this album. Now, this one on this album is sang by George Harrison, the second song he sings on the album. It was released in the U.S. on the Beatles' second album. It was not released in the U.S. as a single, but the Canadian single reached number 2 in Canada. And that same Canadian single, because Americans were going to get it, reached number 68 in the U.S. charts once again.
People jumping the fence to get the Beatles.
Yeah, and this is a song that's considered a longtime standard. I think everybody's heard Roll Over Beethoven in one version or another.
Yeah.
It's been covered by more artists than can be named. What are your thoughts on this version of Roll Over Beethoven?
People must have really gotten tickled by this song because it blows me away that you've got songs that weren't released in the U.S. that are charting in the U.S. Sure, number 68, I mean, on 1 to 100, but still, then what, for not being released in the U.S., that's impressive.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't released in the U.S. There's no radio play. People had to go buy the single.
Yeah.
Out of Canada.
So people were riding up to Canada, buying the singles, and then bringing the records down and selling them to all their friends.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's after I Saw Her Standing There hit, and the Beatles released Meet the Beatles, and the Beatles' second album, and the Beatlemania was in full bore. So I think anybody getting their hands on anything Beatles at the time and they could was important. And I think then after that, all the British invasion, is just let's devour all of this.
The song itself, I'm not a big fan of. I just don't really get it. It seems like it's just, I don't know what the song has to do with Beethoven. Hey, I mean, I'm also somebody that grew up with Beethoven being a big St. Bernard. Not my cup of tea, but what did you think about this one?
I like the song All Right by Chuck Berry, but it is a mid-50s song, and it sounds that way even still. But I get the point because these guys were heavily influenced by it. I think it's got a great guitar intro by George. I think they do justice to it, and I like this version a lot better than Chuck Berry's version.
Wow.
I think George has got an amazing vocal on this. It's got another great bass line by McCartney. It's got great guitar licks, and it pretty much rocks throughout. I mean, it's nothing special to me, but if you take in account for what it is, I mean, you're talking this is a mid-50s song, 7-8 years later after it was released, being covered, and things have changed a lot by then. I think George and the Beatles did good justice to it, and it's a good song.
Oh, absolutely, they did justice to it. It's very much a Chuck Berry style rock and roll, though.
Yeah.
Which, once again, Chuck Berry, he's an excellent artist. He's just not my cup of tea.
So that moves us to the next one. It's another original composition by Lennon and McCartney, Hold Me Tight. It's primarily composed by McCartney, and it's sang by Paul McCartney. This was initially a song that was recorded and supposed to be on their debut album, Please Please Me, but they were not happy with the recordings, and it just didn't make its way on there, so they re-recorded it for With the Beatles. It's been said by both Lennon and McCartney that both of them dislike this song. Looking back at it, they don't care for the song, and they think it was just album filler or something they come up with right away. What are your thoughts of Hold Me Tight?
That makes a lot of sense to me. This isn't a great song. I'm not a big fan of this one. I just feel like it sounded weird. To each their own. What were your thoughts on this one?
Well, as a Beatles fan, even some of the songs I don't like as much, I still like them. It's kind of hard for me to explain because even some of the songs when I was younger I didn't like, I find myself listening to them more. There's very few Beatles songs I skip when I listen to them, and I like listening to the Beatles as albums.
Yeah, you do. And this one, I think where it's placed on the album is an excellent palate cleanser. Because coming off of Roll Over Beethoven, going into this one, this is, this will certainly change.
Yeah, I thought
up.
this song had a pretty heavy guitar sound in it for the time. If you really listen to the guitar is pretty heavy. And it's got a decent bass line, not the best one on the album. The drums are really lost in the mix on this one. And it's almost, I don't know if it was mixed poor or it's just the way it was recorded. I don't know. It's an okay song.
It just sounded weird to me.
Yeah, it's good album filler. I still listen to it. I enjoy the song. I'm not going to skip it. And there's not even really worth skipping some of these songs that are only 2 minutes long anyways. So that moves us on to the next song, which is another cover. It's a Smokey Robinson song, You Really Got a Hold on Me. Now, this one is actually a duet, basically, between John Lennon and George Harrison. They sing this together. This was released in the U.S. on the Beatles' second album. This features George Martin, their producer, on piano. This is the very longest song on the album, clocking in at 3 minutes and 1 second. So I hope you have the time for this one.
They must not have had any homework to run home to and do after this, because they stretched it out to
They sure
3 minutes
did.
and 1 second. Yep.
What's your feelings on You Really Got a Hold on Me?
This song, the timing on it is very noticeable because it's almost like the ticking of a clock, like pendulum on a clock swinging back and forth, or a metronome. Just, it's so noticeable to me. That being said, it's a nice song. Smokey Robinson, good writing, and John and George, excellent on vocals. And George Martin, I even picked up the piano a little bit in there. I didn't. It's not overpowering. The piano is there as a support instrument, and I respect that. What did you think about this one?
Yeah, the piano actually kicks it off as the intro, but it quickly kicks into guitar.
Mm-hmm.
It's another song that I think is strengthened by its great harmonies. The bass is mixed very well in this song, and up front you can hear it. Once again, though, the drums are kind of in the back and tinny, but what you can hear, I'm not being critical of Ringo because I think he's an amazing drum player. It's just kind of the mix and kind of the time. They were a little tinny and not mixed very well, but I love in this, once again, where Lennon strains his vocal. And this is another one where I thought his voice is kind of haunting when he gets into that straining, and it kind of foreshadows what's to come in his later years. But I love Lennon's vocal. Yeah, I thought it was a good song. You know, I'm probably a little partial to the Beatles. I do like it better than Smokey Robinson and the Miracles version, but it just sounds like a more updated version, you know, and maybe a little heavier. Even though it's not a heavy song, it just sounds better to me. So that moves us on to another Lennon-McCartney composition, I Want to Be Your Man. Now, this one is sang by Ringo Starr. This is the one they decided to let him sing. So now we've got all 4 Beatles singing on this album. This is a song the Beatles let the Rolling Stones record first. So it's written by Lennon and McCartney, but the Rolling Stones released it first, and it hit number 12 in the UK charts.
Wow.
The Beatles did not release this as a single. This one was on the Meet the Beatles album in the U.S. What are your thoughts on Ringo, I Want to Be Your Man?
This sounds like the song they should have written for Ringo. It even showcases the drums better. The song that they wrote for him, Little Child, I was struggling to find what that had to do with Ringo. But this sounds like Ringo's song. And it's a nice little love song that's, pining away for this girl that, just being starstruck in love with her. Once again, the drums are pretty heavy in this, and I like that. I'm shocked that they gave it away to the Rolling Stones, but hey, good for them. This is an excellent Beatles song. What did you think about this one?
Well, the Rolling Stones version, this is a kind of one of those things where I like them equally because they are completely different songs. And anytime Ringo sings a song, generally when you get into later songs like Yellow Submarine or Octopus's Garden, it's kind of a themey, funny type of song for Ringo. Yeah. So this was kind of interesting. It would have been interesting to hear Lennon or McCartney sing this song and see how it would have turned out. But I do like the Rolling Stones version as equally. And I think you kind of hit it on the head when you said that the drums are good in this. This is the best sounding rhythm track on this album, I think. It's a pretty fast-moving song. It's got good bass. It's got a decent guitar solo in the middle by George. And it's a pretty decent song all the way around. I think it was a good way to introduce Ringo onto this album, and I thought they did a good job with it.
Yeah, I think so too.
So it moves us to the next song, Devil in Her Heart. This is another cover song. It is written by Richard Drapkin. This one is another song sang by George Harrison. Of course, you have Lennon and McCartney on the harmonies on this, so it's kind of all 3 of them, really. And this was originally recorded and released in the U.S. by the band The Donays, who I honestly haven't heard of. What are your thoughts on Devil in Her Heart?
I also haven't heard of The Donays, but this song, Devil in Her Heart, has a really good, strong bass line. I got a big kick out of the song. It was fun to listen to. Seems like the girl seems like an angel, but she will tear you up. And she's got the devil in her heart. So watch out. George is giving you a cautionary tale here.
Yes, he is.
Yeah, and great song. Great Beatles. This one fits the album nicely, I think. What did you think?
Well, going from I Want to Be Your Man, which was a pretty fast-moving, upbeat song, this is a little slower, less upbeat song.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I wrote that you just said is it's got a really good bass line. It's mixed to the front and sticks out more than anything on this song. It's got Good little guitar licks throughout. I mean, George Harrison's vocal is okay in it. I don't think it's his best, but it's a decent song. It's a good album filler on it, and I enjoy listening to the song. So it moves us on to Not a Second Time, another Lennon-McCartney composition, mainly written by John Lennon, sang by John Lennon. This song was released on Meet the Beatles in the U.S. Now, this is another song George Martin plays piano on. And this is the first track not to have George Harrison on it at all.
Was he in timeout?
I don't know. He must have been. He must have been tired from the previous song.
I guess so. Really took it out of him.
What are your thoughts on Not a Second Time?
I'll tell you, this is a song about a turbulent love affair. The boy has learned his lesson, though, and he's not going to allow her to do it a second time.
He isn't.
Yeah, she can come around again, but he's not going to fall for it because he's already been burned once. It's another great Beatles. George Martin just might be the fifth Beatle there on the piano. So what did you think about that?
If I was to pick a song on the album that I like the least, this is probably going to be it.
All right.
I didn't like the piano on this song. I think it should have been guitar. It just didn't really fill in. To me, this is the one song I can call true album filler.
Yeah.
It's got a decent vocal. The drums are actually decent in this one, but nothing really sticks out to me on this one. It's a decent song. I listen to it, but it's not one of my favorites. So that moves us on to the last song on the album, which is another cover written by Berry Gordy and Janie Bradford. Money, That's What I Want. Sang by John Lennon, of course. This was first recorded by Barrett Strong for Motown Records in 1959, and it's another song that once again features George Martin on piano. What are your thoughts on Money?
Excellent message. This is a very Motown sounding song, especially with the backup singers. The Beatles have taken a song that's very different from their wheelhouse and made it theirs. They owned it, and it was great. Song starts off, the best things in life are free, except for, we have to have a house, which means I got to pay the mortgage, and you can't really pay that with love or anything. You have to pay for it with money. That's what I want. That's what the bank wants too. That's what the bill collectors want. This song is it should strike a chord with everybody. We all need money, right? But I like the way that the Beatles have taken this song and put the Beatles spin on it and put the Beatles sound into it. What do you think about this one?
Well, unlike the previous song that he didn't like the piano on, I love the piano intro into the heavy guitars on this. It's about as heavy as the guitars were getting for the Beatles at the time.
Yeah.
And this is my favorite Lennon vocal on the album. I love his vocals on this song. It's got a great bass line on it. It's probably the second or tied for the first best song on the album as far as drums are concerned. I think the drums are very good in this. Good guitar work. This is a rocking song. You're right. It is a very Motown sounding song with him singing the backups and things, but it rocks too. And Lennon strains his vocal, and I always enjoy when he strains his vocal. You get kind of that live feeling sound, and I just really enjoy this song. It's a good way to do it, and I don't generally like covers as much, but I take it for what it was at the time. All the bands were doing covers. Beatles probably less than anyone, honestly. So that ends out with the Beatles. Do you want to get to winners and losers?
Yep, let's line them up.
Winners and losers.
Well, Tyler, like always, you're going to go first. Why don't you give me your 2 or 3, whatever you choose, least favorite songs on this album?
Okay, so I'm going to go with Roll Over Beethoven for least favorite, just because the writing of it lacks substance for me, and it's overdone. It's just not my song. My second least favorite, I'm going to say, is Hold Me Tight. Like I say, it just sounded weird. I didn't like that one. What are your least favorites?
Probably my 2 least favorites are Not a Second Time and Little Child. I like both songs. They're album filler, but if I had to pick 2 least favorites on this album, those would be it. So what are your favorites on this album?
So the favorites, barring the singles, of course, going with All My Loving. I really love that guitar strumming in it, and Don't Bother Me. So they're right back to back, and I just feel like Don't Bother Me had a very progressive sound to it. I didn't expect from George Harrison, but I really enjoyed it. What are your favorite?
Well, because it's our show and I'm going to pick 4.
Have at it.
The very last song on the album, Money, I love that song. And I generally wouldn't pick a cover, but I had to throw that in as kind of an honorable mention.
It's because it's what you want.
Well, exactly. It's what I want. All I've Got to Do, I love that song. I've always enjoyed the song, and I shouldn't because of what it is, but my number 1 song on this album is All My Loving, without a doubt, but probably a close second to that is Till There Was You. It's so different, and it shouldn't be on this album. It shouldn't be a Beatles song. It shouldn't be something I like, but for me, the Beatles break all those rules, and it works for me. And I'm pretty biased when it comes to the Beatles. There's only a couple Beatles songs in their whole catalog that I do skip. So for me, it's tough.
Obla-dee, obla-da.
There you go, buddy. But that's a ways away before we get to that album.
Yeah.
So do you want to get to the album rating?
Yep, let's rate it.
Album rating.
Okay, so the rating system, if this is your first time listening, we go on a scale of 0 to 10. 0 being the worst, and we can't stand this album. We have to burn it. 10 being it's such an awesome album. It's so perfect that I'm gonna go out and buy it. 5 being smack dab in the middle, give or take. Right? We've had a couple of reviews on this podcast on both sides of the spectrum, and so this one, are you ready to give this rating?
Let's do it.
I'm giving it a 7 because I feel like there's a few songs in there that don't quite have it together for me, and so it brings it down a peg or two. But there's also enough really excellent Beatles, the Beatles that everybody falls in love with, the Beatles that everybody enjoys, that whole Beatlemania in this album, that brings it up to a 7. So it's a real solid 7 for me. Where are you at?
This is a tough one for me because when you're comparing even Beatles to Beatles, the early stuff, you've got to put yourself in that time and realize what it is. You know, you're not comparing this with Let It Be or Abbey Road or the White Album or something. It's just a whole different thing, a whole different time. Only a few years apart, but music had changed so much by then. Not only the music, the attitudes, the recording process, the recording.
You're following the Beatles on their journey. Right?
Well, and it's not just that, but the recording, the technology that come into play and stuff that made the recording so much better that it seemed like it was years apart. We look at the Beatles in 63 here to the Beatles in 70, and you think it's so different sounding and so worlds apart, and it was only 7 years, right? Yeah. But for me, how much this album has influenced me, as all of theirs have, and where this was leading, I have to give it a solid 8.
Right on.
And you know, some days I may be down around a 7 because some of the songs it's hard to say, they're not as powerful as later songs, but they're just as powerful as far as what they mean to the Beatles' career and their trajectory. But there's other days I'd give it a 10 too. So, but honestly speaking, probably a solid 8.
I gotta say that, you know, my giving it a 7, I think there's only one song that's not a cover on there that drags the Beatles down. The rest of their songs that they wrote themselves are just top notch.
I agree, but they did really good justice to most of the covers as well.
Boy, they sure did, didn't they?
Certainly made them their own.
Yes, they did. We are gonna miss the Beatles because, you know, these guys are getting old, the ones that are still around.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I just saw Ringo Starr and his all-star band a couple months ago, and Paul is touring again. I'm hoping to get out and see him one more time for the 3rd time. So
I hope so.
But that's the Beatles' second studio album as they meant it to be released with the Beatles. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, you think we're complete idiots, you agree, disagree, whatever, send us an email to classicvinylpodcast@gmail.com. Feel free to reach out to us. Till next time, bye.
Thank you so much for listening to Classic Vinyl Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow us on Instagram at Classic Vinyl Podcast for updates, and also share us with your music-loving friends.